somebody kicked in the door inside my girlfriend.
Lady Justice is staring down a super predator.
There were upwards of 50 rapes, 12 murders.
Hey there, everybody, I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us. As 2020 comes to an end, and maybe thank goodness for that, we decided to do something a little bit different here on the program, and that's we want to review the top 5 cases of the year. And I think the most appropriate place to start would be one that has gained national attention, absolutely huge, Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell. This is the couple who's in jail, and they're awaiting trial on charges related to the grisly discovery of Lori's kids, Joshua and Tylee, found buried on Chad's property. Now, this has been a fascinating and wild case that started out with 2 missing kids, and it also has included other people who have been linked to the Daybells that died under mysterious circumstances. I'm talking, of course, about their former spouses as well. It's a very weird case. And it's not only that, it's a story that has also affected the local community as well. Take a look.
At first, it was just like, it was sad knowing that 2 kids had gone missing, and then as the case developed, it was just like, this is insane. And yesterday, as the news came out about Chad being taken into custody and finding remains on the property, that was hard. And it was kind of happy that Chad's taken into custody, but it's hard because you don't know. I mean, I don't know if they've confirmed what those remains are, but you can only speculate. And in a way, it's if they are the children, it's, I guess, in a way, closure to find out what happened. But sad to know that what happened to them wasn't right at all. As a mother, it hits home. I can't even fathom it. I have a child who's on the autism spectrum. Also, my neighbor has a brother who's highly autistic, and so it's just knowing that, and that JJ was autistic, and it just kind of hits home in another spot in my heart, you know. And it's just, yeah, it just really was kind of just hard and unfathomable that why would you not take care of your kids?
All right, I'm here with Law&Crime legal analyst Julie Rendelman. Julie, thanks for coming on to talk about these cases, and really, how could we not talk about the Daybells? So as we review this case that really took fire this past year, you look at the charges that they're facing, conspiracy charges. Chad is facing his own evidence tampering charges, and you look at that. One, what does that tell you about what happened to the kids? And number 2, the fact that neither of these individuals have been charged with murder in connection with the kids' deaths, what does that tell you?
So, first of all, thanks for having me on. And I think it's no surprise to anyone that these 2 individuals are the top 5 of 2020, unfortunately. And, you know, when you talk about, you know, the case itself, and we start to think about, you know, the charges, I think the first question that everyone seems to have on their mind is, why have they not been charged with murder? They've been charged with underlying crimes, but not charged with murder. And I think people are quite troubled by that. And I think the simple answer is that the prosecution wants to make sure that when they bring a case, they're bringing it against the right person or people, and that they're able to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And I think at this stage, I think it's clear that there might be some issues in terms of whether or not they can actually delineate which of the players in this case actually took the life and lives of these 2 young children. Because keep in mind, Alex Cox, the brother of Lori Vallow Daybell, was on the premises at the time that the bodies were being disposed of. And he, who is dead now, is also a very likely suspect in this case.
Well, we can't talk about this case without talking about what happened only a few months ago, the discovery of these kids. I mean, that's what changed the whole story. And let's just go back to that moment. And again, here is Detective Ray Hermosillo from the Rexburg Police Department talking more about that.
He had the same style haircut that he had in the videos that I had seen and the photographs I had seen just prior to my welfare check with him in September, the last photograph I had seen on September 22nd. And that was shaved on the sides and longer on top.
Okay, thank you. Were there any other items were there any other items of interest to you on that body?
Yes.
Can you just, what were they?
His hands were folded about chest high,
Detective, can you lift that a little bit higher so people can see?
folded like this, chest high. He had duct tape continuously wrapped from elbow all the way around his arms, over his hands, all the way to his right elbow. Several layers of duct tape that were tightly wrapped. And the best way I can describe it is he had a ball of duct tape over where his hands would be.
Okay. Was that duct tape removed?
Yes, it was.
And what did you observe after that?
His wrists were also bound with another layer of duct tape.
Okay. After that, was there anything else that caught your attention about the way this child was found?
Yes, I noticed that his ankles were also bound with duct tape as well.
And that's not the only thing that we heard about as well, because there's another important player we need to talk about, and that's Alex Cox. This is Lori Vallow's brother, and police have indicated that his cell phone pinged in really important locations in this case, including where the bodies of these kids were found. So that gives you an understanding of what he might have been involved in. Melanie Gibb, who's a former friend of Chad and Lori, she secretly recorded a conversation she had with them, and she asked about Alex. Watch.
I did have a question that I asked Al at one point, your brother, if I wanted to know, like where he was, and he said I did not want to know, and that he could not be found. So what does that mean?
I don't know why he would say that, but it's the same story. Like I don't even want Al to know. I don't want anybody to know, so that nobody has to be worried about it. I mean, nobody has to be questioned about it, so he can be safe.
Yeah. So how long are you gonna be away for? Like, are you ever gonna be able to come out and come back to society again, or are you gonna keep, come back? What does that look like?
I will do whatever the Lord needs me to do every day, so we'll see.
I just wondered if I was ever going to see you again.
Absolutely, you will.
Okay, so maybe when they're done chasing you, you'll be able to come out again, or?
Yeah, it's a ridiculous thing for them to be working with Kay to find me. There's nothing that's gone on that's, you know what I'm saying? Like, they're working with her in some dark capacity. The police are working with her in some dark capacity. There's no reason for them to be after me in the first place.
Yeah, has she threatened you at all?
Yes, lots of times.
And that's not all, because what we also realized is how important these two cases are. And I say two cases, but Chad and Lori are going to be tried together. Here's the judge.
There was an allegation in the response that was filed that this would create additional publicity, which would prejudice the right of Mr. Daybell to a fair trial if these cases were joined. I've considered that. I've also considered the arguments of the state that having two separate courses run in two different cases with two different judges could result in separate evidentiary rulings. There could be some inconsistencies. There would be duplicative hearings. And I think quite concerning given our circumstances right now under our COVID restrictions and the difficulties we have even getting a jury trial at this point. The prospect of having two separate trials where two separate juries would have to be impaneled to try each case is concerning as well. And so when I look at all the factors and the supporting case law, I don't find that the prejudice at this point has been demonstrated that would be sufficient to prevent me from joining these cases.
Julie, we can talk about the trials that the trial they're going to face, but we also want to think about what's outside of this. So we know that the autopsy results of Tammy Daybell have not been released yet. This is Chad Daybell's former wife who died under mysterious circumstances. We also understood that according to East Idaho News, they obtained a letter that indicated the Attorney General may eventually charge Chad and Lori in connection with Tammy's death. Charles Vallow, this is again is Lori Vallow's former spouse. He died as a result of a gunshot during an altercation he had with Alex Cox. Now, Lori Vallow hasn't been charged, but there has been rumors that she could be charged. How do these other deaths tie into this case, and what could happen? Because we learned a lot this past year about the Daybells.
Yeah, and I've said this before, it seems that everyone who touches Lori and her husband seem to end up in a shallow grave. And so with regards to Tammy, I think, it's a tough situation because they had to exhume the body. Keep in mind that there was no autopsy done originally. Allegedly she died in her sleep. They've exhumed the body because of the questions that have come up as to her cause of death. But the problem with her case is that the body is now decomposed. So it would be very difficult to make a full determination as to the cause of death. Now, keep in mind with the pandemic, the toxicology may have slowed down. And so we may find answers. And if we do, and Lori and Chad or one of those are linked to her death, then we're looking at a murder charge. The same thing with Charles Vallow. Alex Cox at the time, it was alleged that he had shot Charles Vallow in what he said was self-defense. And the interesting part of it is we know that Lori was close by. Yeah.
Well,
sorry.
I got to tell you, I mean, it was a fascinating case to follow this past year, but going into 2021, where they're going to have their trial, that's where things are really going to make a big turn, and we're going to follow what happens. All right, we're going to take a break. When we come back, more of the biggest cases from 2020. We'll be right back.
Today, Lady Justice is staring down a super predator. You brought this upon yourself by hurting so many. You have only yourself to blame. I came here today to see this through. I came here today to stand side by side with these other women who you also harmed and to be a voice for the voiceless, like I was for so long. You thought you could terrorize me and others into silence. You were wrong. We rose from your ashes. We rise together. That we've come to this moment of justice is staggering. The trial means so much to so many, but it will mean the most to the brave women testifying and to all of us silence breakers. I thank those testifying for standing, not just for themselves, but for all of us who will never have even one day in court. Today is a day for us to honor how far we've come and how much we've endured to get here. But it is not the end. Know this, we are free, we are beautiful, we are strong, and you will never take that from us. Most importantly, know that the silence breakers will never give up. Survivors will never give up. Thank you.
Well, when we talk about the biggest trial of 2020, how could you not talk about the sex crimes case against Harvey Weinstein, the disgraced former movie mogul? Now, this is a man who had been accused by dozens of women of misconduct over the years, but his trial was focused on 5 charges related to 3 women, and he was ultimately convicted of raping former actress Jessica Mann and sexually assaulting production assistant Miriam Haley. The judge ultimately threw the book at Weinstein and sentenced him to 23 years in prison. Now, I myself was actually in that courtroom almost every day. And I have to tell you, one of the biggest pieces of evidence, one of the most compelling moments of testimony, was when actress Annabella Shora testified against Weinstein, saying that he raped her in the 90s. Here was Gloria Allred, who represents Annabella Shora, after this testimony.
I've seen an evolution over that period of time of what rape is. For example, we used to, there used to be descriptions like acquaintance rape, and before that, is it rape? Is it rape if a wife says no to her husband? Can that be rape? There was a lot of discussion in state legislatures. I was part of that discussion in California about that many years ago. Is it rape if you know the person and is an acquaintance, or is it just a stranger in a dark alley? Is that rape? So this is part of the evolution of understanding that rape is rape, that if a woman does not consent to acts of gender violence, whether that person is an acquaintance, a husband, a significant partner, or anyone else, it doesn't have to be in a back alley. It could be in a hotel room. It could be in your own home.
While cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, we were outside for most of the days, including the day when Harvey Weinstein chose not to testify. Here was his publicist talking about that.
He didn't need to. The prosecution didn't meet the burden of proof, in our opinion. Harvey was fully prepared to. And in the end, we decided, his lawyers helped him decide not to do it because he didn't have to do anything at this point.
How do you feel about the prosecutor calling the blocker a prop?
I think if that's all she has, then you know where her case is.
When was that decision made not to testify? Was it made today in the courthouse?
Harvey's been talking about this for a long time. He's been wanting to. The decision was made today, and he didn't need to do it. Harvey has been wanting to tell his story, to tell his narrative, to get his side out for a long time. In the end, we didn't need to do it, and it wasn't the right forum.
And how was he convinced not to do that? Because he is the client.
I think he heard the same evidence you all heard in the courtroom, and ultimately the state didn't meet the burden, and I think he knows that.
Okay, Julie, why did the jurors decide the way they did, and could the defense have done something differently? For example, if Weinstein did actually testify, would we have seen a different result? What do you make of all that?
So, that is the question, is why the jurors, found what they did. And one of the big issues is, whether or not they felt pressure to convict. And I'm not trying to minimize the fact that something did, in fact, happen to these women. But there's no question that there was things going on outside. I described it as almost circus-like atmosphere, and the fact that the judge allowed for the protest to occur literally right outside the doors of the courthouse, where the jurors were walked by every single day, and every single person out there was anti-Harvey Weinstein. And it's difficult to imagine that a juror is not going to be influenced by what is going on outside. You hope they're not, but I think it's incredibly difficult not to. Now, could the defense have done something else? One question is, I hate questioning because no one wants to Monday morning quarterback, but at the same time, there's questions as to whether or not the defense should have just gone after the idea that the case had not been proven beyond a reasonable doubt, instead of literally attacking the witnesses and also trying to make it as though Harvey Weinstein was someone who tried to do good for these women.
It was a big win for these women. It was also a big win for the government. Here's actually the Manhattan DA speaking after this really dramatic conclusion.
These are 8 women who pulled our justice system into the 21st century by declaring that rape is rape and sexual assault is sexual assault, no matter what. Rape is rape, whether it's committed by a stranger in a dark alley or by an intimate partner in a working relationship. It's rape, whether it's committed by an indigent person or a man of immense power, prestige, and privilege. Rape is rape, whether the survivor reports within an hour, within a year, or perhaps never. It's rape despite the complicated dynamics of power and consent after an assault. It's rape even if there is no physical evidence, and even if it happened a long time ago. This is the new landscape for survivors of sexual assault in America, I believe, and this is a new day. It's a new day because Harvey Weinstein has finally been held accountable for crimes he committed. The women who came forward courageously and at great risk made that happen. Weinstein is a vicious serial sexual predator who used his power to threaten, rape, assault, trick, humiliate, and silence his victims. He has been found guilty of criminal sexual act in the first degree and will face, on that count, a state prison sentence of no less than 5 years and up to 25 years.
While the government was happy with the verdict, you know who wasn't? The defense. Here's Donna Rotuno, who represented Harvey Weinstein.
You know, obviously it's a bittersweet day. We're disappointed. We knew we came in and we were down 35-0 the day that we started this trial. The jurors came in knowing everything that they could know about this case. We couldn't find a juror that ever heard of Harvey Weinstein. You know, there's an appellate process. It will absolutely be appealing. The fight is not over. It is absolutely horrible for me to watch my client be taken into custody. We don't feel good about that at all.
Julie, nobody really feels that sympathetic for Harvey Weinstein, and has a ton of troubles out in California related to new charges. But speaking on the 23-year prison sentence, is that fair? And is it possible he will remain in prison that entire time?
So is it fair? You know, look, the question is, you know, at the end of the day, the judge had great leeway in making a decision as to what the appropriate sentence was. And this is what he determined was a fair sentence. Now, one must note that there are individuals out there that have committed armed rapes and have gotten less time. At the end of the day, do I think he's going to serve the entirety of the time? I do. I think either way, even if he were to win the any of the appellate issues, he's now facing the California cases. And so I don't think that he has freedom in sight anytime soon.
And look, you know, there's a separate question of whether or not all of those women, those other accusers who testified as to uncharged conduct, if they should have been allowed to. That's a separate issue that's being decided in other courts, and we'll have to see if it has any effect on the Weinstein case. But look, we're going to take a break. When we come back, 3 other major stories from 2020 that we want to talk about. We'll be back. Now over to the biggest conclusion of a case in 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo, the man who went by various monikers, but his most popular title, his most renowned title, the Golden State Killer. After pleading guilty to 13 murders and 13 kidnappings and admitting to dozens of uncharged rapes and burglaries over the years, he was officially sentenced to multiple life terms in prison without the possibility of parole. It was a hearing that was heart-wrenching, particularly because we heard from victims and their loved ones. Take a look.
He raped me repeatedly, moving me in and out of the house after each time. He made himself comfortable in my home, and he stole my family's personal belongings as I lay helpless or sat tied, gagged, blindfolded, and naked in the cold December night, waiting for what unthinkable act he would violate me with next. He tormented me, and he told me over and over again he would kill me, and I believed him. At 3 different times that night, I thought I was going to die.
Finally, I can go forward. I have justice that I've been waiting for, and I never thought I'd get it. I have a full second half of my life ahead of me, and you've got what you got. However, 13-year-old Mary needed justice. If only back then, someone could have said to me with confidence, if they could have said to me that one day he'd be caught and one day he'd be held accountable. I can't help but think what a difference that would have made for my future.
I'm going to sing a little song. It's really short. It's what my grandpa used to sing when we would say goodbye to somebody. And it goes like this. Bye-bye, Joe, bye-bye. Bye-bye, Joe, don't cry. And Joseph DeAngelo and his mother can go straight to hell. This is for him. I know he can't look at me, and he was blocked during this, whatever his plea thing was. But I mean this Obviously, I haven't been able to forgive yet. I think after all this, after Friday, I'll be able to forgive. But in the meanwhile, this is what I have for him. Not you, defenders. Him in the orange. The subhuman.
We also heard from a survivor who had a reason that he alleges that the Golden State Killer wasn't apprehended sooner. Watch.
I truly believe that this man has something in his pocket, knowledge or something in his pocket that allowed him to elude capture for so much time. I don't know exactly what that is, but I just know the nature of men and people. And I think that without that confidence, that he wasn't going to get caught. And I think it's more than braggadocious, arrogant ego, that he couldn't have had a second life and did what he did and live in our society without looking over his shoulder.
I mean, Julie, it's a bit surprising for a guy who was able to avoid capture for so long, really was able to live a normal life, that all of a sudden, when captured, he admits to the things he did, he pleads guilty. Shocking. And why do you think we had a closure in this case when a lot of people never thought it was going to come?
So, I mean, look, when all these things happened, it was the 70s and 80s. It was a different world than we live in now. There was no video. There was no cameras at every person's home. And the police were not communicating the way they do now. And there was no DNA. And DNA is what ultimately solved this case and brought him to justice all these years later. Now, when we talk about closure, I'm not confident that anyone who was the victim of this monster will ever get closure. At the same time, I think, as one of the women said, finally, after all these years, there's justice, and there's a feeling that these individuals know at the very least that this person can never harm them and can never harm anybody else ever again. And maybe that gives them some sense of closure.
One of the things that we were waiting to see is if we would hear from D'Angelo himself. Would he provide a statement, an apology of some kind? Here's what he had to say.
I've listened to all your statements, each one of them. And I'm truly sorry to everyone I've heard. Thank you, Your Honor.
But is this the last we will ever hear from D'Angelo? Because after his sentencing, questions were raised as to whether he's linked to other crimes that we don't know about. There were items taken from his house. Listen to this.
How certain are we that he stopped committing these crimes in the late 80s? And if he did stop them, can you offer any insight as to how someone like that might have been able to stop them? And did it bleed out and did it push out in other ways in his life? Since then, were there other signs? I'm just curious what your insight is.
I think I tried to answer that earlier. I don't think we'll ever know. I mean, honestly, on the day of his arrest, I got a text message from a colleague of a Wikipedia article about when did forensic DNA come into existence, and it coincidentally was 1986. And so, the question needs to be posed to Mr. D'Angelo.
The items that were taken from his home, could you speak to what those items were, and if any of those were ever returned to some of the victims or survivors, if they belonged to them?
I don't think I can speak to those. I don't think so. I don't know about Amy or Tin or any of the prosecutors, but I don't think it's, at this point, I don't believe the arrest warrant or the search warrants have been unsealed from the court, so I don't think it would be appropriate to comment at this point. Maybe someday, though.
All right, Julie, what do you think? You think we're going to see him charged with other crimes? Could he face another trial? How's this going to play out?
So I don't think he's going to face any more trials. That doesn't mean he wasn't involved with other crimes. And this is one of the things we talked about. People talked about why he didn't get the death penalty, and there were many reasons that were brought up. And one of them, I think, certainly that's beneficial to those like me who are interested in knowing more about this individual is it gives an opportunity for a really smart investigator or a really smart interviewer like yourself, Jesse, to get in there and speak to him and try to find out everything there is to know about how this man ticks, what he does, how he did it, and whether or not there are other individuals out there that he either raped or killed. And I think that time will tell whether or not he's willing to talk more. I think as he gets older and is closer to the end of his life, it may motivate him to talk more about what happened.
I did have an opportunity to speak to Anne-Marie Schubert about this, and she said really the ball is in Joseph James DeAngelo's court if he decides to speak. I mean, one of the things we learned afterwards are these videos of him in his jail cell where he doesn't appear to be this frail individual. And it just goes more to this kind of manipulative behavior. So when you look at these videos and the way he behaved in court, when you think about that and you think about the statement that we just played about what he said in court, what does that tell you about his mindset and what he's prepared to do?
Yeah, when we first saw him, he's in a wheelchair, he can barely sit up, and then all of a sudden he's standing up boldly, apologizing to everyone, and then we see him obviously in his room exercising. I don't think it's any surprise that his whole life has been manipulation. That's the reason he's been able to get away with it for so long. At the end of the day, does that mean that he wouldn't at some stage in his life still be meaning to come clean in terms of other things or aspects of who he is? Maybe, but you always have to recognize that anything he tells anyone must be taken with a grain of salt because you never know what he's lying or manipulating you about.
And as D.A. Schubert told me on a previous occasion, he's only going to do what benefits himself. That's who he is. All right, we'll take a break. When we come back, two of the biggest cases that actually defined 2020. We'll be back.
Mom, I love you. Please, I love you. My kid, I love you.
Why is it my side is listed?
I can't breathe nothing, man. It's so good, man. Mom, I love you. I can't do nothing. My face is gone. I can't breathe, man. Please. Please let me stand. Please, man, I can't breathe.
We can't talk about 2020 without discussing that video, which sent shockwaves across the world, sparking calls for police reform. There were demonstrations regarding racial inequality, and of course, violent protests as well. And talking, of course, about the death of George Floyd, we go back to this video, and what do we see? We see these former officers during an arrest, allegedly arresting George Floyd over him allegedly trying to pass off a $20 counterfeit bill at a store. And they're shown pinning Floyd to the ground with Derek Chauvin placing his knee on Floyd's neck for almost 9 minutes. After this encounter, Floyd's heart would give out and he would eventually die. Chauvin faces murder and manslaughter charges. His former colleagues, Tu Tao, J. Alexander King, and Thomas Lane themselves face aiding and abetting charges, aiding and abetting murder and manslaughter charges, I should say. And I want to start with Dr. Michael Baden, who's the forensic pathologist called by, who was retained by Floyd's family. Here's what he had to say.
The cause of death, in my opinion, is asphyxia due to compression of the neck, which, as Mr. Crump indicated, can interfere with blood flow and oxygen going to the brain, and compression of the back, which interferes with breathing. When he said, "I can't breathe," unfortunately, many police are under the impression if you can talk, that means you're breathing. That is not true. I am talking and talking and talking and not breathing in front of you. So the concept that a person says, I can't breathe, like Mr. Garner, like in this instance, means you should take it seriously.
We also heard from Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison, who's overseeing this prosecution. This is what he had to say after the preliminary hearing in September.
Today's hearing marked another step in what will be a long process toward justice. I think the Floyd family, the community, and the people of the state of Minnesota for their understanding and patience as we make our case and continue to move forward to a trial. At this time, I'm not in a position to answer any questions. Those of you who know me know that I do answer questions. However, today's focusing is a motion to consider motions that have been heard by the court, and therefore I will not comment on them. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Julie, this is such an important case, but I have to wonder, what is riding on this? How many people are going to be looking at this? And what is this a tough case for the prosecution? Because really, so many eyeballs will be on it when it's eventually broadcast for the world.
Yeah, and you know, the big issue was whether it would be a public trial, and we know now it's going to be. It sounds like it should be, and the argument is because people want to understand what is happening in that courtroom. People want information, they want transparency, and they want accountability. And so when we look at the multiple defendants in this case, it's hard to say that all of them are in the same position. I think the case against Chauvin is obviously going to be the strongest for the prosecution. Obviously, he's going to argue that there's aspects as to the cause of death, including George Floyd's drug use, that brings into question whether or not Chauvin's actions caused his death. I think when it comes to the other officers, I think the case is going to be a little tougher, particularly for at least one of the officers who never actually places his hands on George Floyd at any point. And so they're going to have to, each defense attorney is going to be working to delineate their client from each of the other individuals to make sure that the jury recognizes that they are not a part of everything, that the jury must consider their acts separately and apart from everyone else's.
Julie, separate and apart from what actually happens at the trial, this case, how did it impact this country? What changes do you think it's already made or would change or would make moving forward, aside from the legal case?
So it's funny, we talk about, how this case has made changes. And look, I don't think there's anyone in the United States and abroad who hasn't seen this video footage and heard the last words of George Floyd. And there's no one who's human that is not completely and utterly horrified by what they saw. But when we talk about change, I mean, obviously we know that there's been protests to try to push for police reform. One of the changes that happened is that there were arrests made. And years ago, there wouldn't necessarily have been arrests made in this case. But I think the ultimate decision as to whether or not there's real change is, will police reform come from this? Because if police reform doesn't come from this, then it has all meant absolutely nothing.
And what we're looking out for, of course, is, Floyd's family has filed a civil suit. We know that there's the criminal trial that's going to happen next year, 2021. And the prosecutors are not happy that it's going to be broadcast in the way it's going to be broadcast. So there are a lot of eyeballs on what we're going to see and how we're going to see it. But the death of George Floyd, it actually renewed interest in a different case, and that's 27-year-old BREONNA Taylor out of Louisville, Kentucky. This is the unarmed EMT who was gunned down by police in her very own apartment. We talk about George Floyd, how everybody knows that. Everybody knows about BREONNA Taylor. The officers at the time were executing what's called a no-knock search warrant, believing she was involved in drug operations, and what ultimately resulted was horrific. Now, Kenneth Walker, who was BREONNA Taylor's boyfriend, was in that apartment. He exchanged fire with the officers that night, and he called 911. Let's take a listen.
911, Operator Harris, where is your emergency? I don't know what's happening. Somebody kicked in the door inside my girlfriend.
Okay, where are you located?
I'm at Springfield Drive, apartment 4.
Springfield Drive, apartment number 4?
Yes. Oh my God.
Okay, how old is your girlfriend?
She's 26. Bring it. Oh my
You said 26.
God.
Where was she shot at?
I don't know. She's on the grill right now. I don't know.
Taylor's family received a $12 million settlement with the city, a civil settlement. Here was the mayor's response.
In addition to these policy changes, this settlement includes a payment to BREONNA's estate of $12 million. I'm grateful for the hard work of my team and that of County Attorney Mike O'Connell and his team, and the cooperation and thoughtfulness with which the Taylor family and her attorneys work with us to get to this point.
Now, this controversial raid led to demonstrations and calls for these officers, this law enforcement members, to be charged with murder. A grand jury did not indict the officers, but former Detective Brett Hankinson does face 3 counts of wanton endangerment for allegedly blindly opening fire. Here's Attorney General Daniel Cameron speaking more about this.
Our team walked them through every homicide offense and also presented all of the information that was available to the grand jury. And then the grand jury was ultimately the one that made the decision about indicting Detective Hankinson for wanton endangerment. I think that in terms of what happened the wee hours of March 13th, in terms of that particular or specific date and what happened that night in the apartment, I think it is unlikely that there will be any additional prosecutions that come from that event itself.
Okay, Julie, we have learned that the Kentucky Prosecutors Advisory Council has refused to appoint a special prosecutor. You heard Daniel Cameron's comments, the grand jury. There were some controversy surrounding that. Has justice been served? Is this just the way the legal system works? What's your opinion of what we're seeing in that state?
So, look, keep in mind that the feds are still looking at this case, so it's not over. It doesn't mean that there's going to be additional charges, but I think one of the things that people want to understand better is what happened. There's always this feeling that the public is kept in the dark about important matters, and this is an incredibly important matter that people want to know the details. And so one thinks that the federal investigation may yield additional details. Quite frankly, the trial of the officer that was indicted in this case, that trial is going to yield a lot of information that people don't have. And, even though he's not charged with murder, it's still going to provide that information. It's going to give you what happened before, during, and after. And that's what people want, is information. And again, I'm not sure that this case is exactly the same in George Floyd in terms of the intent of the officers involved, but there's no question that the Breonna Taylor case raises serious questions once again about police reform, the need to deal properly with whether or not a no-knock warrant should or shouldn't happen, and how to make sure that the information in those search warrants is in fact valid and up to date.
There's so much confusion about what happened, and I'm curious, do you think we'll ever really get the straight answer about what happened that night, about who knocked, how they knocked? You mentioned the trial, the upcoming trial of Brett Hankinson for those charges that he's facing regarding wanton endangerment. I mean, are we ever going to get to the truth?
So I don't know, I don't know that we ever totally decide what the truth is. Particularly, I'll give you an example. When they came to the door, there's one neighbor that hears them announce themselves. The other neighbors say no. So the question becomes whether or not you find the neighbor who thought one thing is credible or the other neighbors are credible. And so I don't think we're ever going to be able to make a complete decision. Are we going to know more based on the federal investigation and based on the future trial? Absolutely. But I think at the end of the day, it's going to be up to each individual to make a determination as to what each witness is saying is credible and what's not.
And real quick, about 30 seconds, the charges that Hankinson is facing, is that easy for the prosecution to prove? Easy to secure a conviction?
So nothing's easy, because, there's an issue that, there's no question that there was a shooting that came from the inside of the apartment towards them. And so there's a question of self-defense. It's certainly the easiest of the charges
Right.
because it doesn't require intent. It requires wanton behavior.
All right. Well, we'll have to see how that unfolds. And clearly, there are more questions than we really do have answers. But Julie, I thank you for taking the time and speaking about the top cases of 2020. Who knows what's in store for 2021? But I can tell you one thing. We here at Law and Crime are going to cover it. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jesse Weber. We'll see you next time.